This is Permissionless Liberty.
Hello, everybody. I'm Adam Knott, and I'm joined by Daniel Sanchez, as always. And today we're going to be talking about one of Daniel's articles, The Iron Law of Kleptocracy. And when I read the article, what it reminded me of was really one of the first questions of libertarianism, which is what did we as libertarians believe the meaning of government is, and what did we expect that it was going to do? And did it end up doing what we were hoping it was going to do? And if not, and the other question was, well, how does the government, or if we want to call it the state, how did it come into being? So these are pretty fundamental questions. And as soon as you get involved in libertarian thinking, social theory, I wouldn't say this is libertarianism 101, but these are fundamental questions that we eventually get to, which is how did the government come into being, or the state come into being? And then what did we perceive, what did we libertarians understand was supposed to be the purpose of it? And then what went wrong? So that's pretty basic right there. But of course, through history, there have been many different libertarian thinkers and writers. But of course, there have been thousands of them. But only a few dozen have risen into prominence where their names are where they're household names. And so in Dan's article, he mentions, I think, a few authors who are well-known authors and how they perceived the issue or how they described it. And so we're going to discuss that today. And then Dan will, I'm sure he will also hopefully give his comments on his perspective. And I know I have a few things to say about all of this. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think that this conversation is very related to the episode that we did, the episode before last, when we were talking about the Declaration of Independence and especially the sentence of the Declaration of Independence that begins with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And because in the Declaration, in that passage, there is a theory of government embedded in it. There's a theory of, what the purpose of government is, even what the origin of government is, and it's very much inspired and informed by what John Locke believed was the purpose and origin of government. And when the Declaration of Independence says that all men are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, it then posits that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So, just right there, that's a, purpose statement and an origin story of the government, that government is instituted among individuals to secure rights. And really that is, that's a statement of fact that governments, like when they were instituted by people, that was the purpose in mind of those people for instituting it. And then it continues deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And this, again, is really the theory of government that John Locke developed, and his origin story of the state that he told in his two treatises of government. And John Locke posited that legitimate government is established basically by contract, basically in an agreement among individuals to submit themselves under common laws enforced by a common government, in order to secure their persons and property against plunder, basically. And so under that conception, what John Locke and the founders called tyranny was basically a corruption of government. It was an abuse of power and an abuse of the law. And Frederick Bastiat really believed in that too. In his classic work, The Law, he characterized tyranny as the law perverted, so that instead of protecting person and property against plunder, the tyranny is the perpetration of plunder against person and property. So he called it legal plunder because it was plunder perpetrated under the color of law. And this was the view of the founders and of Locke. And it's also the view of a lot of great thinkers that are more recent in history, like Ludwig von Mises, Ayn Rand, Leonard E. Reed, that basically it's what we now call a minarchist point of view. And that is the point of view that we should have government, that we need government, that we even need a monopoly government. But that monopoly government should be minimized. It should be limited only to securing rights. So only to basically the functions of the police, the courts, the military, and that these institutions should only be used to secure rights. It should be used to protect the citizens against criminals. It should be used to protect the country against foreign aggressors, etc. And that when it goes beyond those bounds, so as the Declaration of Independence says, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends of securing rights, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And so, when the creature of government turns against its creator, then as the creator and as the people who the government is supposed to serve, that the people can fire its security force, basically, and hire and even create a new security force. Now, that's not the only origin story of the state, and that's not the only understanding of what the state's purpose is. That an alternative view is generally adopted by anarchists as opposed to minarchists. And particularly in this discussion, I'm interested in anarcho-capitalists or anarchist libertarians. And as I wrote in my article, the prevailing theory among ANCAPs, which is short for anarcho-capitalists, is that the state originated not, as I write, the state originated not by agreement, but by aggression, and not by contract, but by conquest. And a thinker who really developed what's called the conquest theory of state formation was a German sociologist named Franz Oppenheimer in his 1908 book, The State. And so he has this great passage, which I'll just read because it's really vivid. He wrote, "The state, completely in its genesis, essentially and almost completely during the first stages of its existence, is a social institution forced by a victorious group of men on a defeated group." So there's that conquest piece. "With the sole purpose of regulating the dominion of the victorious group over the vanquished, and securing itself against revolt from within and attacks from abroad. Teleologically," so teleology is the purpose of something, "this dominion had no other purpose than the economic exploitation of the vanquished by the victors." And, exploitation, you can read that as a synonym of plunder, the way that Bastiat frames it. "No primitive state known to history originated in any other manner. The little history learned in our school days suffices to prove this generic doctrine. Everywhere we find some warlike tribe of wild men breaking through the boundaries of some less warlike people, settling down as nobility and founding its state." So that's the quote. And so basically Oppenheimer is saying that the conquerors learn to limit their plunder, not for the sake of the conquered. They just limit their short-term plunder for the sake of their own long-term plunder. And the way Oppenheimer characterizes that is it begins to dawn on the consciousness of the wild herdsman, because he perceived that when states formed, it was nomadic herders who would vanquish peasants and then establish a state over them. It begins to dawn on the consciousness of the wild herdsman that a murdered peasant can no longer plow, and that a fruit tree hacked down will no longer bear. In his own interest, then, wherever it is possible, he lets the peasant live and the tree stand. And then Oppenheimer goes on to explain that the conqueror will then protect the conquered from rivals, from rival plunderers. But again, that's not really for the sake of the conquered. It's for the sake of maximizing their own plunder. And the way I put it in my article is that ultimately a shepherd protects his sheep from wolves, not for the sake of the sheep, but for the sake of his own supply of wool and mutton. But it can be useful for the sheep to think that the shepherd is protecting them for their own sake, because then it makes them love their chains. It makes them docile. Because then they start to accept this protector theory of the state, this servant theory of the state, and even that the state is their own creation. Even that in the distant past that they themselves came together to create it for their own good. If they think that, then they will be more submissive, and they will fear the conquests, the consequences of doing without them. And so that's how plunder becomes viewed as tribute and ultimately taxation. That it's not these plunderers stealing from you. that it's these protectors taking their just tribute and taxation so that they can protect. But as I said in the article, that the state, according to this view, which is my view, by the way, does not tax so it can protect. That's just the cover story. Really, the state protects so that it can tax more. It protects its tax cattle so that the tax cattle will be more productive, and that and that it does it also tends to do so, very selectively and very grandiosely, and very ineptly, but that's the real reason. And so I think that whether or not it actually happened one way or the other historically in any given situation is less important to me than the question of which sort of behavior does the institution of the state tend to incentivize? Does it incentivize protection for the sake of the people, or does it incentivize plunder, and does it incentivize using protection as a cover story? So I think that's really the ultimate question, irrespective of what happened in history with any given state. So yeah, Adam, what are your thoughts about all that?
Well, my first thought is when you started with the first origin theory of the state, which was kind of the idea that, as you said, that governments their job is to protect rights. What I take from that is that the kind of libertarianism that our founders were, the prevailing idea of the purpose of government, as I kind of mentioned in previous discussion, was to protect us against what I call or refer to as universal crime. That means, meaning things, if you think about all the criminal activities a person can do within a country like the United States, for example, you'll find that some of those crimes are crimes that everybody does not want to be the victim of. So murder, assault, fraud, certain crimes like that, extortion, let's say. But then you'll find that there are other crimes where there's really, we could even call them victimless crimes. The crime is just in not obeying the law, but there's actually no universal crime that's being protected against. So if the government says to me, Adam, we need to build a bridge, and we're going to write a law that says if you don't pay, you're now breaking the law, and so now we can use the force of government to come after you. That, and the way I see that, it's not a universal crime. They're saying, well, they're basically legislating a crime or manufacturing a crime by writing it down in the legislative book of the country and saying, well, from today forward, if you don't do this, this will be now a crime. So the kind of crime or the purpose of government that, as I understand it, that the founders were interested in, the kind that I'm interested in, that I would consider more legitimate, even if we had a government that I was powerless to let's say abolish or alter, I still would feel much more comfortable with it if that government was just protecting me from universal crime, as you refer to it, Dan, as protecting rights. So what I found fascinating is that is the one strain of libertarianism, and the word plunder, if we just take plunder in its just basic meaning, which is, some group of people comes over the hill on their horses, there's a few houses down there in the valley, they come in with their guns, they arrange it so that those people are not able to prevent them from taking all their stuff, and then they go back over the hill. So plunder, in its most basic meaning to me, regardless of its subjectivity from different points of view, is the idea that I'm just going to take your stuff, and I have the power to do it, so I'm going to take your stuff. So that, to me, that's an instance of universal crime. So if the government is protecting me against plunder, I'm predisposed to agree with that concept. So anyway, that's how I interpreted the part about. But I think it's difficult, of course, theoretically. It's hard to say, well, there was a group of people, there was 20,000 people, they had no government, and one morning they got up and they decided, wow, we want to found a government by contract. That theory is not going to work, because when you look back, you're going to see that they already had a form of government already. There was nobody was ever clearly free of having it. So it muddies it. So the origin of government's kind of muddied, because even, for example, in this example that you gave by Oppenheimer, he said a warlike tribe basically conquers a less warlike people and institutes its state. But my thinking, obviously the less warlike tribe probably had a state. So in a sense, it was just changing one state for another, because unless he's going to claim that there was a tribe down there of 2,000 people and they had no state, I'm going to be very skeptical of that. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I'll let you comment. But I want to have a little more time to think about the other origin of the state idea that you had outlined.
Thanks. Yeah. So, in situations where what Franz Oppenheimer described is actually what happened. So, when like a group of plunderers raid a population, and then and so so that, as you have said, is what you would call universal crime. So then, what about when the next stage in the process happens, in the process that Franz Oppenheimer described happens, where the plunderers settle in, and instead of like a one-time sort of a one-time burst of plunder and then just leaving them, they just plunder regularly over time. And then what if, it's sort of like Stockholm syndrome. Are you familiar with that?
Only by name. Doesn't come to mind what the actual phenomenon is.
So Stockholm syndrome is the phenomenon when abductees start to
Identify with
their kidnappers. And so, what Oppenheimer is describing is basically that the plundered, the victims of universal crime, start to not even think of it as universal crime. They start to think of being plundered as in some way legitimate. And even though the motives of the universal criminals, the plunderers, never really changed. So, you know, I'm curious what you think. At one point in that evolution, does it stop becoming universal crime, or does it, if it does stop being universal crime, like is it when they settle in? Is it when the people start to think of their own plunder as somehow legitimate? What do you think?
Well, I think a great example is our founding. We talked about Declaration of Independence, and you don't have to know much history to know that the complaint of the colonists was that the King of England was increasing his legislative or legal restrictions on them. So, in other words, it wasn't to hear them complain. They would have written to him and said, "Listen, we want to do this and this. Can we get your okay?" And he would have said, "Yeah, that sounds good to me. Go ahead and do that." But that's not, that whether that's realistic or not is beside the point. The point is that that's the precise opposite of what was happening according to them. There were pronouncements or decrees coming down that were becoming more and more restrictive, is my understanding. So they said, well, they made a very brave decision to rebel against that and paid dearly for that, with many lives, and then tried to institute a government that pushed that back to what they thought was a more natural level. And as soon as they instituted that, as I would say, then the process started again. Then, how long would it be since the founding of the country before they would pass another, 5 years later, where they pass another set of laws and another set, whether it's public education or the currency, creation of the currency, and then continue all the way up to the New Deal, and then all the way up to the Great Society, and now into COVID lockdowns, and now into abolition, the attempt to abolish free speech. So I don't think we have to really theorize about it like, let's say, an abstract tribal situation, when we're living through an example of kind of a pattern that's pretty obvious. Now, our political adversaries, maybe they see some of these increases as positive. From their perspective, let's say, I know enough to know that the left views the New Deal and the Great Society and those things as like huge advances in mankind's political existence. And then from the libertarian perspective, those were huge declines. It's just the opposite, because from my point of view, any so-called advance from a progressive or leftist or collectivist point of view that basically that tries to conceive law in terms of equalization of the population is at odds with my conception of government, which is to protect me and as we've been talking about, protect me and my belongings and my physical well-being, and protect those things. That's why I am a libertarian, or why I identify as one. And so I'm not sure. Hopefully I'm touching on your question. I'm not sure I fully answered it, but
Well, what I'm getting at, I'm just curious your analysis of like that thought experiment based on Oppenheimer's origin story of the state, because I think I remember in a previous episode you um, you didn't really think that the term legal plunder was very helpful, and also that you don't really find it helpful to frame things in terms of rights. And so I'm just trying to like tease out whether that's consistent with your notion in this episode of
mm-hmm.
of universal crime,
um,
especially in light of in light of the fact, okay, go ahead.
When I say universal crime, I'm not referring to the government. I'm referring to, okay, I'm a citizen, you are, and let's just say you and I, let's just say outside of the rooms of our apartments, the government's going to change to whatever you and I want. So you and I get in the apartment and we say, Adam, Dan, we start talking and negotiating. And what I think we essentially want is if regardless of of whether this could actually happen, in our dreams, what we'd want is when I walk outside of here, I'd only want government to do one thing. I'm just going with this theory here. Protect me against these 6 or 7 forms of crime. So government do that. Now that's irrespective of whether the government decide to be the enactor of those crimes. I'm leaving that out of the picture right now. I'm just saying, as a libertarian, if I did agree to having a government, if I got to decide on one abstractly, then what would happen is there'd be a group of people and they'd have a piece of paper and would say, okay, if anybody does these things to Adam, go apprehend them and put them, apprehend them. And then we're going to have a court date. So that on that list would only be, in pure libertarian theory, it would only be murder, fraud, assault. There wouldn't be anything on that list that say, well, if Adam doesn't help you, if Adam doesn't give to the poor, go apprehend Adam. If Adam doesn't give to the building of the bridge, go. There wouldn't be on the list. It would just, all it would be is they'd only be empowered to apprehend somebody who was trying to harm me in those strict ways. Now, from a leftist perspective, the harms that I do to people exceed that list by myself accumulating assets. From a leftist perspective, that is harmful when I start to accumulate assets greater than my fellow citizens. So that has to, on the list, then has to be, when Adam starts doing this, go tax him to get the anyway. You were trying to interject.
Okay, so your ideal is that the government protects you from, murderers, as you said, fraudsters, I would presume burglars and muggers.
Just to clarify that, I'm claiming
kidnappers.
I'm not claiming that is my theory of government. I'm claiming that my first thought as a libertarian when I'm 17 or 18 and I start to think about politics, before pre-theoretical, if somebody says, well, Adam, if we have a government, what do you want them to do? What should they do? Before I even get to reading any books or anything, I'm claiming that what would have identified me as a libertarian is I would have said, well, I want the government to just do these things and not do any of the other stuff. And then somebody would said, well, Adam, that's not realistic. Here's why that won't work. Okay, let's say they win that argument. But I'm saying that's the first intuition of my school of libertarianism, what I would have said I wanted. Now, thinking about it later as an adult and thinking about 30 years, I have different ideas on how that works.
Okay, so you would want that government to protect you from robbers, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what if the robbers overthrow that government that was trying to protect you? And what if the robbers kept robbing you, but then eventually evolved to fancy itself your government? Is there any kind of distinction to you between the robbers before and the robbers after?
No, because everything that I'm judging when I walk outside, when I walk outside of my apartment as just a human being, I have expectations for how I should conduct myself, and then I have expectations for how anybody else should conduct themselves. and I have expectations for what I can ethically ask of another person and what they can ethically ask of me. And this is just on a very base level. So that when somebody gives me a bad deal, like says, well, Adam, I have a gun and I'd like you to give me your watch, I intuitively know it's not a good deal. We talked about coercion. So that doesn't change if it's the government and the government says, well, Adam, we have a bridge we need to build in upstate New York, and we would like your contribution. And then I say, well, oh, thank you for the offer, but I prefer not to. And they say, well, but actually, we want to restate that because we didn't state it the way we really meant it. If you don't pay for this bridge, these are the penalties that we have for you.
Okay,
So
I don't think you're seeing what I'm trying to find out. So I'm just not. I don't understand why you're okay with calling a robber when they're small scale and when they're like widely regarded to be a robber, but you're not okay with calling that same person a robber when they get big enough and when and even if they start claiming to rob you for your own good and or for the good of other victims of that person's robbery. So in other words, like, why do you object to people referring to the government to a government that taxes people not for the sake of, well, against their will at all, and also for the sake of things that the person doesn't want to contribute to?
okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. My answer for that is that when in a typical robber situation, or somebody wants to assault me or murder me, that person has no legitimacy in society or between us. So this person's taking a very high risk that he or she will not get harmed, and just doing a basic criminal activity. So in the other situation, when the government is coercing me, they have broad legitimacy in the eyes of the public, and to some extent, from my point of view. And the reason I believe that is to be the case is I believe that the government, the reason that there's a government in 99.999% of the surface of the earth, probably derives from something within me and within us. In other words, there's probably some need within us that's pulling forth and that's making sure that governments never disappear. So therefore, if I see governments existing because of a demand that is essentially coming from me, then that means that the abolition of government is nonsensical for me to request or to aim for, number one. And number two, to moralize it as a criminal when I'm the one who demanded it is also kind of nonsensical. It's almost like it's almost like calling myself a criminal. So what I end up believing then is that the problem isn't to how to get rid of government. It's what's the structure of the relationship between me and government on the assumption that government exists because I'm demanding it.
But what if that demand is a product of brainwashing? Because again, that's part of the Oppenheimer story, is that, the robbers start to develop protection as the cover story, and especially because if the robbers are then in charge of educational institutions, like what if it's because the robbers, after vanquishing the conquered, then brainwashes their children into thinking that the robbers are necessary, and then that just continues in perpetuity. Like, are those robbers and their successors then any different?
My initial reaction is, I don't know why we have to use that example when we're living through the example that we're talking about. So why can't we say that the founding fathers threw off the yoke of the British government, and then once that was done, they set their sights internally and founded a government? Because whatever government they founded, it ended up doing the thing that libertarians are complaining about. So why do we have to? I don't understand the usefulness of using Oppenheimer's. I'm not against it. I'm not saying don't read it or don't do it, but I'm saying, wouldn't it be more useful if we just, since we're living through it right now, that the founding fathers instituted a government which has been turned, from the libertarian point of view, has been turned against us. It's doing what you're calling plunder. I mean, I agree. In other words, it's saying, listen, Adam, we want to build a bridge in upstate New York, and you're going to pay for that bridge. You're going to do that, or you're going to jail. Okay? They're going to coerce me into paying for it. So I think they're doing everything. In other words, Oppenheimer's theory, if valid, I assume applies to our current government, unless you're saying that, no, we're just talking about another one that happened in another continent. I'm assuming we're living under what you're talking about. So therefore, so then the theory is, okay, then they're brainwashing us to think that this is for our good or something. But you and I are beyond that. Any intelligent libertarian is not falling for that. So, there's 2 million libertarians in the United States or whatever. And I mean, they obviously are not falling for whatever Oppenheimer says that our government's trying to teach us. I know what I want my government to do and not do. And I'm willing to take the responsibility that if it brainwashed me to want it to do things that hurts me, then that's on me. In other words, if I'm stupid enough to say, yeah, you brainwashed me, and now I'm asking you to raise my taxes to 80% so you can build a bridge in upstate New York. You guys win. You brainwashed me. Well, I'm going to bet on myself that I see clearly what I want from my government. I can't vouch for another person who might be brainwashed by our government. I mean, there is such a thing as we've learned in the last few years, there's a lot of what's propaganda going on. There's no question. So everything you read, may, especially coming from the press, may not be true. But since what Oppenheimer is saying is being done to us, what's the value in using a robber and tribesman allegory or abstract thing when we have it right now? When people are moving out of California because of what we're describing. So they're doing it right in front of our face. So
I think it matters because I think it influences, like, how we think of that influences how we think we can solve the problem. Mm-hmm. Because if we accept the Lockean and the founders like theory of government, then we'll always think that, like, okay, well, the answer is to alter our existing government, and failing that, to abolish it and institute a better government. But I'm curious, like, well, what if even the founding is a cover story? Because if you trace it back through history, the founders and them being like the successor government over this continent that succeeded the British Empire. And okay, well then what is the origin of the British state? Well, if you go back far enough, you ultimately find Oppenheimer's story. I mean, we're all familiar with, Vikings as these Scandinavian raiders, and we're also familiar with like the Germanic barbarians who were constantly invading the Roman Empire. And the Scandinavian Vikings, they're Germanic too, and so you can, it's not too far fetched to think that what was happening there is that Germanic invaders were invading a subject population. Like for example, the Franks were a Germanic tribe, and they conquered what is now called France. They came from like the Germanic areas and invaded what is now called France. And then it was mostly populated by a people called the Gauls. And the Gauls were like a settled people, like in Oppenheimer's story. And then the Franks established themselves as a ruling class, just like in the Oppenheimer story. Similar thing happened with the British Isles, that Angles and Saxons, a Germanic tribes of raiders, that they invaded the native population of the British Isles, and that population had been, was basically agricultural. That it was like, very much like under the sway of the Romans, much of it, and the Angles and the Saxons became, they might have become a dominating population. But then there was the Norman conquest, and that kind of overlaid another layer, that like the Normans were these descendants of Germanic invaders who adopted a successor of Latin, so a Romance language, that they were basically French speakers, and then they conquered the British Isles, and then the Angles and the Saxons, who were previously conquerors, they became subject population to this Norman aristocracy. And that's why English is a combination of Germanic words and Latin-based words, or ultimately French-based words. And so, that the crown of Britain is ultimately descended from those Norman conquerors, who, again, their objective wasn't for the good of the conquered. Their objective was basically to maximize plunder and to manage their tax cattle as well as possible to manufacture that. And of course, eventually that was obscured by the cover story of protection of the people, and then that became sort of like the divine right of kings, and it became like loyalty to the king, and that was ultimately the state that then held sway over the American population. And then you can think of like the overthrow of that in the American Revolution, that it was overthrowing a taxing power and like a tyrannical power. But at the end of the day, the people who were the leading class who led the throwing off of the British yoke, that they had in mind to establish their own state that wasn't like completely different from um, from the British state, and and like again, the cover story was, okay, we are instituting this government for the genuine purpose of all legitimate governments, which is to secure rights. But how do we know if that really was the underlying incentive? At least for a lot of people, maybe for some super idealistic people it was, but maybe for some people who wanted a nice position in government, and who wanted to like use government to favor their own interests, if it ultimately was the same incentive structure that traced all the way back to the Norman conquest, um, and the Frankish conquests before that, and then I think it's if that's the case, I think it's legitimate to wonder if we should keep that in mind and remember that people who are calling themselves protectors from robbers are ultimately just robbers themselves, and to not shy away from calling a spade a spade.
What I see in how you're describing this, Dan, is that, or what I guess where I see an issue is that um, there's a phenomenon, which is one group of people subjugates another group, let's say, and so then what I guess my question is this subjugation action that they did, a collective action of this group of people, is it a normative thing or is it universal? Because the group that was subjugated, when they're being attacked, of course we see that, oh well, they've lost this conflict. But if this subjugation is part of a human condition, then apparently that group that just got defeated must have defeated some other group, and but now they're in a little bit of a static situation. There's nobody around them to subjugate, so they're kind of just doing their thing in this other group. But historically, either this is a universally occurring thing that every group does, so that's one of our choices, and the other choice is no, every group doesn't do this, only some groups do it and some don't. So depending on which way we decide to conceive of the process that you're describing, then that logically entails other things. So for example, if every group in history does that, then that must mean that I'm part of doing that. In other words, because I'm part of one of the groups. I'm either part of the group that comes in and does the action, a conquering action, or I'm part of the conquered group. But as part of the conquered group, I was the one who conquered the previous group, was here before. So in which case, I'm no morally better than the other group, except that I was just in a static situation when the other group came to conquer me. Or we say, no, some groups don't do that and some do. But if we say that, that's going to be a tall order. So that means we're saying libertarians don't do that. See what these other people in the world do? We don't do that. And I think that that's also problematic, because probably I know that we would get contradicted on that by obviously the other side of the aisle. So that's where I struggle with it, is that um, the British conquered whoever was in that land, and then we have to see how it applies to us, and we're one or the other. Either it's, if it's normative, one group does it, one doesn't. If it's a universal thing, then every single group does it. So I think we have to choose which one of those, and then from there we'll be thinking more clearly about it, and we'll be able to see whether we're going to go with that theory. I think when I read Oppenheimer, I think he implicitly seems to imply that there is a group that is neutral, that doesn't do that, and that was minding their own business. And then I don't know, but we have to pin that down. What does he mean? Does he mean that there was herders there? They had conquered the land from the other people who had occupied it. Now a new conquering group came, in which case there's really it's just something that humans do. Or he's saying that there's a pristine group that's, so if I turn to my government and say, you're a robber, that implies that I must be part of the pristine group. To me, means that I'm pristine. You are attacking me. Because if humans do it by nature, then when I'm calling them a robber, then I must be a robber, because it's my human nature. And I'm confused because I don't realize that in what they're doing is just the opposite side of what I do when I go out. And I'm just seeing a mirror that's saying, well, Adam, when you go out, here's what you do. I just want to remind you that you did these things, these 10 things. And when that person came to you, it's very similar to what you've been doing. That's the universal one. So, that I tend to believe, I guess by nature, I believe that all humans do the same things. I think libertarians, if everybody in the world dropped off and there was only 10 million libertarians in the world, I think the same thing would happen. I think they'd have to form a government, and then that government would start to grow because it would grow beyond its universal crime, or in your words, rights protection function, and they'd reform a government, which would then start to grow. That's my thought. So libertarians aren't pristine. Libertarians are, I would say, confused.
Well, I don't think just because something is universal at this time in history, or even over the course of like recent centuries in history, that means that it's part of human nature. Because it can just as well be the case that that the state emerged at some point in human history, and that it then spread like a cancer, that it spread through conquest or through emulation, or both, and so it and it sustained its own spread by using its monopoly power on the use of force to propagandize the people about it. And so then, that among all civilized people, that became the prevailing ideology that was just then, sustained through inculcation across the generations. And if you go back to before the state emerged, you could find like pre-state societies. And that doesn't mean that they were libertarian utopias, because the state is not the only conceivable non-libertarian institution. That you can have institutions against the ideal of rights to person and property, that didn't emerge through the state. And so, like, there's this book that I've heard of that is called Envy, and I forgot how to pronounce the author's name, but Murray Rothbard talks about it in his paper, and there's a book named after the paper called Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature. And in that he talks about primitive tribes. And a lot of these primitive tribes don't have what we would call a state. That they're anarchist in a sense. They're basically anarchist. But they're not libertarian. And because they don't have the norm, the established norm of private property. And so Rothbard and the author of Envy that he cites talks about how in a lot of tribes, like, as soon as, like, any individual in a tribe starts to accumulate significantly more than other individuals, then through overwhelming social pressure, if not through force, just the community, not even organized by a state, but that's just the prevailing norm, is that the community presses that individual to give up his quote unquote excess wealth to the community. And so we, and so, like, the norm of libertarianism, that is like a recent development that people, through discovering or through examining our God-given natures, have developed through the works of people like Locke. And even though Locke himself came to the conclusion that limited governments are consistent with human nature, Lockeans like Murray Rothbard, and the way they analyzed human nature and the incentives involved, came to the conclusion that that monopoly governments are not consistent with that, and thus, anarcho-capitalism. And so I don't think it is necessarily part of human nature that we have to have the egalitarian moral code of primitive tribes, or that we have to have the ideology of the state. Right now, almost everyone does, because almost everyone isn't an anarcho-capitalist, and that's why, everyone resorts to either using existing states or trying to create new states. But that doesn't mean that either of those things are part of human nature. And I think that if the virtues of anarcho-capitalism and its consistency with human nature and the truth of economics can disseminate through the minds of thought leaders and through them to the hearts of the general public, that we can have a libertarian society. And I ultimately only think that we can have a libertarian society if the myth of government as public servant is dispelled. Because, just like Juvenal, the Roman author, wrote, who watches the watchmen? People call the monarchist state the night watchman state. Well, like who watches the night watchman? Who, how do we keep, if we give the night watchman state monopoly power, how can we expect it not to fall to the temptation of using that monopoly power for plunder? I don't think it's possible. And so I think that it's essential to recognize what governments are doing as plunder in order to finally solve the problem of liberty.
When you're talking about, when we talk about the possibility that in smaller gatherings of people, in the past, that there may have been stateless societies. One thought that came to mind was a very kind of a famous example that the physicists used when they were trying to describe quantum mechanics. And it goes back to, in the early 1900s. And a little boy goes into the candy shop. I don't know if you ever heard this one. And he says, "I'd like a penny's worth of mixed sweets." And the candy store owner hands him 2 pieces of candy and says, "Here you are. You can mix them yourself." And what that little parable illustrates was that at what point, from when you had a barrel full of mixed candy, at what point did the concept of mixing then really become nonsensical? Was it at 2 pieces, or was it at 3 pieces, or was it 4 pieces? And I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say there is actually no number that could be arrived at which would determine that, if some mathematician wants to try to prove me wrong, but I don't think they're going to succeed. So what I guess the way I'd apply that to is that I think when we use the term state, or what the state means to me, or when we use it in libertarian discussion, it's referring to the time when the society has gotten to a size where you have administrative departments, where you have a tax collecting mechanism, an enforcement mechanism, and these are separate people or separate entities. So we're talking about society that's evolved to a certain size. And because of the way I think of libertarianism, that never comes up in my thinking, because I'm focused on whether I'm being coerced or not. So to me, if I was in a tribe of 20 people, the way I'm going to think about it is whether what I'm doing on a daily basis is because I actually chose it, or because the other 19 people said, "Well, Adam, we all understand what we need to do here, and if you don't do it, we're going to hurt you." So, but I say, "Oh, there's no state." Well, there's 20 people. They don't have administrative departments. So I see the state, what we're referring to as the state. I don't see it as an abstract entity. I see it as a concrete threat that I can actually go locate, of coercion, that I can actually locate in our society in the legislation. But if it weren't in the legislation and I was being subjected to coercion, I still can locate it. I can I still know where the locus of the coercion is. I know what person or what group is levying the coercion and threatening me if I don't do certain things that they want to do. So it's not voluntary. So I guess therefore I would argue for that. I would look at those early tribes and say, and I would try to find the state, because I would find whoever the chief was, or whoever the in-group was that was making the rules, and then whoever the person was who was deciding who was outside of those rules, who was responsible for that, and then who's responsible for administering the punishment, whatever the punishment is. And I would call that the same thing that I'm trying to deal with now in the year 2026. To me, it makes no difference if they have administrative departments or if it's just a small group and they're saying, hey, dude, it's a nice teepee you have over there. Be ashamed of something. Be ashamed if it got burnt down overnight. Oh, well, how can I prevent that from happening? Well, I have a daughter who needs a husband. That could work. We can work out something. So, so I guess I do see. So I'm arguing for a universal conception that that since coercion is a part of human nature, that when that's levied in a group setting, that's what I'm worried about. And then I'm calling it, when it gets blown up into a very sophisticated society that has departments, now it's just become more powerful and more all-encompassing. But so I'm looking at it more as a universal thing, as opposed to an option that we have to not do, that maybe humans could improve morally and no longer do the things that result in the state. Someone could argue that, and it'd be interesting to see if they could. But again, how would the libertarians react if we cut them free or cut us free? Because I think the other thing is that not all conflicts between people are resolvable objectively. In other words, it's definitely possible, I feel, for two people or two groups to have really different ideas and then have a conflict occur where there's no solution possible based on the ideas that both groups have at that moment. You could say, well, if we talk to them for 5 years, but at the moment there's the conflict. So, for example, I can walk out of my apartment now and offend somebody, and I'm going to say, well, how could you be offended by that? And they're saying, how could you say that? And they really mean it, and I really mean it. It's like, no, you're crazy. And they're saying, no, you're crazy, and you better never say that again. So now here's a conflict, and that hopefully we're not both armed. So what I want an adjudication mechanism. I think I do, unless I just been brainwashed. But I think I want a method so that I don't have to kill that person and they don't have to kill me. And if I set that up, now we're back to where I've set that in motion, where now I've been responsible for creating the situation that I'm complaining about as a libertarian. Because I don't think conflicts can be objectively solved at the root. I mean, some maybe you can. Society says, Bill, you're way out of line. You killed 10 people. All these things, and society's going, okay, yeah, Bill needs to go to jail for sure. But there's a whole bunch of things in the middle where it's like, that's not a crime, and the other person go, yes, that is a crime. Adam has 3 cars, and he's driving them all the time. Look at all the pollution he's putting in the air. That can't go on. It needs to be in the legislation. He needs to be punished. Somebody could make the other side and say, no, here's why that isn't a crime, and both sides will believe that they're correct. So then I think the need for a government arises so that there's not just a war of all against all. I mean, I'm not saying that's my solution. I'm saying that so then I'm bringing back government in by my own desire to solve these conflicts that I know are going to happen. I was at a dinner party last night, and we were talking about, interesting personal interactions with two people who are going through a divorce and child custody battles. And what one of the parents was, all these legal arguments that one of the parents had made, they were so outlandish. But it basically was the parent trying to get custody of the child, willing to say anything necessary to get the custody. And so here is like, these kind of conflicts happen just routinely. I mean, millions of them a day. And it seems like it's unrealistic to think that there's some way to have those go away by a change in human nature. So then how are these conflicts that are sure to happen going to be settled? There has to be a settlement mechanism, or it just seems like there has to be a settlement mechanism. Now, I just created the demand for what we're calling government, what I think we're calling government, or to establish it. So then, okay, now I've got a problem, and it seems like the problem's not me, but I think it kind of is me, because I'm a human being who goes out and gets in conflicts.
Well, there's a lot of anarcho-capitalist literature that covers this. That there have not only theoretically, but historically, there have been non-state providers of juridical services that they're, and so and that, like, a lot of times, what just like anything else, the reason that we assume that only the state can provide that kind of service is that the state at some point monopolized it. And so there were non-state providers of, like I said, juridical services, who were incentivized to deliver impartial verdicts based on prevailing theories of justice among a community at the time, because they had an incentive to. Because the reason why people would continually go to them to judge cases is their track record of impartiality and honesty and justice. But then, a lot of times what happened is that the king would just take it over. They'd just say, like, okay, well, now all these judges are working for me. And yeah, and then because, just like Leonard Reed said, that if the government nationalized shoe production within one generation, we would have no idea how, without the government, we would ever do without shoes. Yeah, and so, like, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of definitely private dispute resolution resonates, I think, with libertarians. The idea that I would love to be in a world where dispute resolution was a service offered to me, and there were competing companies, and I definitely believe, at least I haven't given tons of thought to that idea, but I definitely think, I don't know, maybe you agree, but if there was a will, there would be a way. In other words, let's say all the citizens of the United States agreed that we could do that. Could that actually be instituted where, because what you could do is you'd say, well, listen, the government could say, well, here's certain things that we don't want to do that with, because we want to be able to coerce our citizens to get certain funds to do certain things. But we could take these other things, lower priority things for us, and farm those out in a sense, or to leave or free those to be, in other words, if take the lowest levels of things that we're now using our powers to obtain, and somehow free that. For example, what are the courts called where you pay them $3,000 and you get a small claims court? Couldn't that be privatized such that people who wanted to have a small claim had to? The government says we don't have the budget to do that anymore because we're so inefficient. We can't run the bureaucracy. It's not worth it to us for your $10,000 small claim against your plumber. So therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to no longer protect you against these kinds of universal crime, fraud, fraudulent business, deceptive business practices, breaking of contracts on a small level under $25,000. We're no longer going to protect you against that. But what could happen? So therefore, there then might become a market, might form somehow if the government was committed to that. But the reason that I think that can't happen is because the argument for that idea then would have to be, so the government says, well, here's the 10 things, the 10 levels of strata, that the most important one, the third most, and they have 10 of them, and they say, well, this bottom one we're going to free up. Well, they're starting to go in they're starting to shrink themselves for ideological reasons. Well, then why not the number 8 one? And then why not the 7 one? And why not the 6 one? In other words, that would set in motion an evolutionary process that they have no interest in initiating. So because of that, we can't get even the bottom rung where our government could retreat or relinquish its powers in the interest of having the what we call the free market or the marketplace provide those services. That can't happen because that would be an acknowledgement that in principle there were things that they shouldn't be doing or can't do, and that argument would then could just be argued up the chain. So therefore it goes in the other way because you have to solve whatever problem that is by one of two methods. You either have to solve it collectively with the power of a coercive state, as you're referring to, or a government, or you have to solve it by another method without that. Well, without that, once you remove the government or the state, what you have is freely choosing individuals that we refer to as the market. So that's why it continues to grow, because
well, just because a government doesn't want to relinquish power doesn't mean that it won't. Like, if it fears the consequences of not relinquishing. And so I have this other article that would be great to cover at some point called Staring Down the State, where I explain how this could happen. Because, I mean, governments have relinquished powers in the past.
Yes.
You could characterize, the establishment of the American government as a vast relinquishing of power, because, like, the successor government to the British Empire decided that it didn't want all the powers that the British Empire did. Although, there's argument over that, about that, like whether the first American governments were actually any less oppressive than the British Empire that it threw off. But in any case, there have been liberalizations, and there were liberalizations in England, that there were liberalizations with the former Soviet states, and I really think that that is a function of ideological change, that governments will um, oppress to whatever degree they can get away with, but governments also recognize that there's some degree to which they can't get away with it. And it generally doesn't come to a head because violent conflict is costly. And so when states recognize that there's just no tolerance in public sentiment for certain kinds of tyrannical policies, they do back off of those policies. It's not likely that they're going to back off of juridical services as the first thing that they back off on, because that's such a linchpin of their ability to do other tyrannical policies. But so then we start with hills that they're not willing to die on. But I think that we're more likely to have the kind of shift in ideology that results in permanent liberalization if we teach people to regard the state as the plunderer it is, because then they're not going to try to tinker with it for like their own rationalized objectives, and they're not likely to make compromises where they trade certain liberalization for more tyranny in some other sector that they think is less bad, or whatever. So yeah, so I
Well, and, one thing that I think is really interesting, in recent, last 80-year world history, and to me, it's just so obvious, but yet I hardly ever hear anybody that seems to see what I thought I saw. But the way I saw it was that when we had the communist revolution, and in my history books, the ones I've read, the original goal of socialism or communism, it was based, the theories of the early communism and socialism were based on the recognition by certain socialist and communist theorists that the root of the problem was the organization of society based on the price mechanism. Because the price mechanism is a cold, calculative kind of reality, and is kind of doesn't care about, the price system doesn't care about humanity. It gives a structure and that everybody has to conform to. And they saw the problem in terms of that, and so they set upon the theorizing of a society that would abolish that. That was my understanding. So the two key things that I thought communism and socialism were set out to do was to abolish the price system, number one, and, which is closely related to that, substitute the market allocation of resources by the allocation of resources by a committee of people. So when I look back at history and the major two communist experiments, to me, it's so obvious, were Soviet Russians and communist China, where that animating theory was earnestly tried. And as I see it, those two societies were driven to the ground by the attempt to eliminate the price system and substitute the allocation of goods, and to substitute for the price mechanism an allocation of goods and resources in society by committees of people. So they tried that for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And both societies were bankrupt. So what happened was the Soviet Union in 1990 was totally 100% bankrupt. So they had to withdraw they couldn't maintain their force structure because they had squandered all of their capital on by trying to allocate it based on committee. There was no discipline of the system that the price system. There was little discipline because they had protected their society from the price system, or tried to. So they ran out of money and they had to withdraw their domination of the Baltic states and also their program of trying to infiltrate South America and Cuba, and then form communist partnerships throughout Asia, etc. In China, I don't understand why people that won't admit or won't say that what happened was that they tried to do the same thing and they were dirt poor. And somebody at some point opened up China to the market system, to the price system. That what they wanted to do is retain political control, tight political control, which they have pretty much done, but allow economic exposure to the market, to the world market. So they have what leftists are salivating, which is total political control. And the way you know you have that's because you never hear about Jack Ma anymore. He was a uppity businessman who just came up too high and separated himself too much. And I don't even know if he's still alive. You never hear his name anymore. He was like the Elon Musk of China. And so both Russia and China had to end their communist experiment, but yet there's no history of that. I mean, I'm sure you can find it in a book somewhere, but in other words, that's should be just world history that communism failed, and therefore we can't. What was it they tried to do, and therefore we shouldn't do that anymore. So, where I'm going with this is that I feel that what happened was that I don't think that they changed their ideologies. I think they expanded it to the point where it went to its logical conclusion, and they bankrupted themselves. And so what that means to me is that the bureaucratic system, if expanded, runs through its resources very quickly. And to me, that's the weakness of the bureaucratic model that we have adopted now in the United States, that we're now expanding and tried to expand through NATO and tried to keep expanding it when China and Russia had to recede. And we thought we would have a superior bureaucratic model and expand on it without realizing that it's the bureaucratic model itself that's the problem. We're supposed to be selling liberty, but we ended up somehow we transformed ourselves, and now we're selling bureaucracy. But we think because it's American style bureaucracy that it's superior, which is a joke, which is unintelligent. But we're now in the process of where we were in the process where we thought we could expand American bureaucracy as the brand, the number one bureaucracy brand, without realizing that there was two superpowers who tried to expand the bureaucratic model. And they did us a great favor by totally destroying their societies for us to observe. And we didn't learn anything from that. And so what I think that happened was our intellectuals quietly changed tack and said, well, we can't openly fight for communism now, but since we still want that, we'll just have to work within this system that we hate and try to arrange for that, but not openly call for that. And then they've been doing that for the last several decades. And now that they've succeeded to a large degree, now they can start popping up and saying, well, actually, we are for communism. So Mamdani comes out. You're starting to hear more people say they're actually for communism, whereas the last 30 years, you couldn't say that. And now it's safe. I guess we've made the world safe for communism again, because we're so far down the line of bureaucratization that communists feel safe. They see the finish line and they feel safe speaking plainly now, which is really fascinating. Did I
Those
take
are
us too far adrift there?
No, those were really spot on observations. And I disagree with your conclusion from those observations. And there's a lot that I could say about how I think that kind of bankruptcy resulted in a change of ideology. But we're over the 90-minute mark, so we should probably wrap it up. But I really enjoyed this conversation, Adam. And
Thank you, Dan. Me too. Your article you mentioned, we should probably just return. Maybe you could put that on the lineup, the one that you mentioned a few minutes ago. And
sure, yeah, and to our listeners and viewers, if you haven't been able to tell, like basically what we're doing is we're trading off, where like either we alternate between which one of us is taking the lead on discussing like our ideas. And so next episode we'll be focusing on some of Adam's ideas, and probably the episode after that we could talk about my article, Staring Down the State.
Let's plan on that if unless you have a better idea in the meantime. Okay, well, I think we had some very interesting exchanges, and hopefully our audience enjoyed it. And I want to take this opportunity to thank whoever does watch us. I know my wife watches it, so it's just like one of the funniest lines I've ever heard was, I don't know if I already told this funny little joke, but it's about this couple that was going to have a blind date, and but they're talking on the phone before their blind date, and so the man says to the lady on the phone, he says, "Well, are you pretty?" And the woman replies, "Well, my mother thinks I'm pretty." And so it's if regarding our viewers, well, my wife likes to watch my show, so that's all I need.
Great.
So yeah, looking forward to the next one, and I'm thinking anyway. I think what I'm going to do is Balaji is somebody who's a guy named Balaji is a guy who's working on a project he calls the network state. So he has the goal of trying to reconceive government using the concept of the network. And I'm a little critical of it. So what I want to do is what I do is have a Grok conversation. Rather than me do all the research, I'm going to ask Grok to research it for me. And then I'll ask Grok some questions, and then I'll discuss it here and tell you what I came up with, what Grok and I came up with. And then we can chime in and see what we think about what Balaji's trying to do with the network state, and what we think are the strengths of what he's trying to do and maybe the weaknesses. Because what I like about it is he's actually trying to do something. He's actually trying to problem solve and maybe create a new society. But I'm not sure I agree with 100% of the way he's trying to do it. But hey, I got to give someone credit who's trying to reshape government for the better. So.
Sounds fascinating. Looking forward to it.
Great. All right, everyone. Well, we'll hopefully see you in 7 days.
Yeah. See you then.